Hello, and welcome to today's GGKP webinar, Measuring What Matters, a new methodology for collecting and reporting data on fossil fuel subsidies. My name is Benjamin Smith. I'm the Senior Knowledge Management Officer at the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, a global collaboration of organizations and experts providing the policy, business, and finance communities with knowledge, guidance, data, and tools to transition to an inclusive green economy. The partnership was established in 2012 and is led by the Global Green Growth Institute, the OECD, UN Environment, UNEP, and the World Bank. I'm happy to announce that registration is still open for the 7th GGKP Annual Conference to be held on the 21st and 22nd of October 2019 here in Seoul, South Korea. The conference will explore the theme of achieving global green energy transformation. It will take place alongside the Korea International Renewable Energy Conference, KIREC, as part of the Global Green Growth Week. For more information, please visit ggkp.org. Registration closes on October 7th, so register now if you don't want to miss this great event. Fossil fuel subsidies impede sustainable development, drain national budgets, and divert resources from priorities like health and education. And that's before we account for their impact on the climate crisis. Today's webinar will introduce a new methodology for collecting and reporting data on fossil fuel subsidies. This methodology was developed jointly by UN Environment, OECD, and IISD's Global Subsidies Initiative. Starting in 2020, UN Environment will feed this data into the SDG Global Database to evaluate global and national progress on fossil fuel subsidy reform under SDG Indicator 12.C.1. Our panelists will also be sharing Italy's experience with fossil fuel subsidy review under the G20 process and Indonesia's experience with its phase out of fossil fuel subsidies. This is the second in a series of 5 webinars organized by the GGKP and the International Climate Initiative Project, Green Economy Transformation, in cooperation with the Partnership for Action on Green Economy, PAGE. The project is funded by the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety, BMU, and is jointly implemented by the Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, GIZ, and UN Environment. Before we get started, I strongly encourage all of you to raise questions throughout the webinar. It's a great opportunity to engage directly with the experts and to learn more about how countries are managing the transition away from fossil fuel-based economies. Just type your questions into the chat box on the right-hand side of the webinar dashboard, and our team will share it for our panelists to address during the Q&A period. After the webinar, we'd appreciate if you complete a 5-minute survey. Your feedback is valuable to us and will help us shape our future webinars. If you have any technical issues, email us at contact@ggkp.org and we'll help you troubleshoot. Finally, please note that a full recording of the webinar, including all presentations, will be available on the GGKP website tomorrow. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Peter Woodards, the Group Director of Energy at IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Peter has worked on climate change issues for over 15 years and in more than 25 countries. He's worked in almost every area of the energy economy, including energy efficiency, electricity sector planning, renewables, carbon capture and storage, nuclear power, upstream oil and gas, with a recent focus on competitiveness. Peter, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, and I hereby turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thanks for that very kind welcome. And I was really pleased as well that you started with the statement, fossil fuel subsidies impede sustainable development, because I think that's what the challenge is ahead of us now. And when we look at some of the numbers and some of the impacts of fossil fuel subsidies, this is a serious issue. We know that subsidies are more than $500 billion US per year, and that's money that could be spent on something else, on development objectives, on health, on education, on whatever countries see as their priorities. We know that the reform of all the subsidies would save of the order of 10% of world greenhouse gas emissions. So that'd be a huge contributor for us to try and get down towards those Paris Agreement targets. And we know that subsidies lead to overconsumption. with the effects then on health, on global warming, on congestion, and all the other problems that we're facing in our cities and around our countries. And finally, of course, by continuing to subsidize fossil fuels, we're holding back clean energy alternatives. And that is obviously, again, holding back the progress that we need to meet the Paris agreements and to meet the SDGs. Lots and lots of attention on the fossil fuel subsidy issue at the moment. If people who've been following or at the New York summits, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, says we are in a battle for our lives, and his second of 3 key points was stop subsidizing fossil fuels. Rachel Kite, also involved with the Secretary General as a special representative and with SE for All, has also made comments around subsidizing carbon pollution makes no sense, and that we should be clearly supporting clean energy and clean air, not subsidies. Now, when I will introduce the speakers as we go along, we've got 3 excellent speakers today, and what I always think about webinars, if there's good speakers and then a good amount of time for us to ask questions to them at the end and have a proper discussion and really see get the benefits from their experience and their ideas, then it's going to be a good webinar. So I'm really pleased today that I think we're going to have a very good webinar. I'll make a couple of comments first just about my organization, about the Global Subsidies Initiative of IISD. Next slide, please, Jessica. There is a lot of work has been done over the years by organizations on subsidies. How big are they? How do you measure them? What impacts would they have? And of course, how do you reform those subsidies? And if you look at www.iisd.org/GSI, you'll find a wealth of materials there that we've generated over the past 12 years since we've been working on this subject as well. And my organization, the GSI of IISD, we're a not-for-profit, we're independent, and we aim both to help countries identify those subsidies that work against sustainable development, but then also to help reform them as well. Next slide, please. And we have worked in over to develop, I think one of the key parts here is that you need to understand how big subsidies are in order to have proper informed discussions in public about whether and how they could be reformed. We've worked in over 20 countries and regions. The slide here shows in the blue bubbles there how India's energy subsidies have changed over the past over 3 years, from 2014 to 2017, and you'll see a big reduction there in this particular case in oil and gas subsidies, higher subsidies going into the electricity sector, and a growth in renewable subsidies, but of course at a much lower level. So, but to generate this sort of numbers, it takes a lot of work and a fair amount of expertise, and assumptions need to be made, and we're going to learn a lot about that today. Next slide, please, Jessica. And then just a few thoughts to get us started from our perspective on some of the why is this issue? Why do we need to get data on fossil fuel subsidies? Why is it important? What are the challenges ahead of us? I think the key issue here is unless we have data and unless it's in a user-friendly form, it's very hard to get a proper, engaged, informed debate on public expenditure, because that's what we're talking about here. Subsidies are a choice that governments make about how they spend their money. Is that a good choice? Could it be spent better? And we need data in order to get that out. We also see that countries who have undergone some of the peer reviews that you'll be hearing about today, I'm delighted we've got both Indonesia and India and Italy on the call today. They both recently undertook a G20 peer review on their fossil fuel subsidies, and almost every country we think who's undergone one of these reviews and has looked at its subsidies has seen a lot of value in assessing them. They've seen that some of those policies are outdated and no longer as effective as they used to be, and that there are better alternatives. And I think the clear hope here as we look into 2020 is that this new methodology that we're going to be talking about today and the reporting that will come under SDG Indicator 12C1 will support a lot more debates in a lot more countries, and therefore we expect a lot more subsidy reform as well. There are a range of challenges, of course, and we'll hear more about those today. On the consumer side, consumer subsidies are not just government budgetary transfers, so it's not just government budget going from one line to another. We also have to think about regulated prices. If they're held below what would be a price in a full and free market, that's a subsidy too, and that needs to be calculated and assessed again, whether that's a good policy. And then there's a whole set of issues around the producer side when we look at upstream oil, gas and coal, and we need good estimates of government revenue foregone. So if there have been tax exemptions or other measures, government is not getting as much money in as it could, and therefore its expenditure possibilities are lower. Again, are those good policies? This is a technical and data challenge, but I would reassure people that, firstly, it's not impossible, and secondly, the sorts of subsidies we see are very common in many, many countries. So we can look at each other's work for examples around this. So enough about IISD and about GSI. I'm pleased to now introduce our first speaker, Dr. Joy Eri Kim. So she's been working in the area of macroeconomic and environmental policies at UNEP and other organizations, specifically on the issue of green economy, on green fiscal policy, on climate change, on trade, environment, environmental governance, now for over 20 years. At UNEP, where she's now based, she's leading green fiscal policy work and as a technical advisor on the Partnership for Action on Green Economy and its delivery. And she's worked at a whole set of other organizations in the past with the OECD, United Nations University Institute of Advanced Studies, also Aoya Magukin University, also in Tokyo, the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research in UK, and the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy in Seoul. So a great experience, Joy. And you've been leading, of course, the development of this methodology under SDG Indicator 12C1 as the custodian organization, UNEP. So we're delighted to hear from you today on the methodology, how it was developed, how it's going to be used going forward. The floor is yours, and thank you very much for joining the webinar.
Thank you very much, Peter, and hello to everyone. As Peter mentioned, that my presentation is largely to present this new methodology paper on measuring fossil fuel subsidies in the context of SDGs, which was conducted together with OECD and then GSI, and this was recognized as internationally agreed methodology to measure fossil fuel subsidies to report under SDG indicators on measuring fossil fuel subsidies. Next one, please. So, and then I would actually speak a little bit about, what are the key messages of the methodology report, what are our recommendations in terms of measuring fossil fuel subsidies, and then a few points about next steps and way forward. Next slide, please. I think that to save time, I would actually skip this slide, but basically, as you know, there are 17 SDGs and there are many more targets, and even there are more number of indicators, but there are 96 indicators are related to the environment and 26 indicators are actually under the custodianship of the UN Environment, and SDG 12C1 is actually one of them. Next one, please. You can move on next to the next one, please. So this one is to visually sort of show you how the data is going to be gathered in the process of the SDG reporting system. So it actually applies to all the other indicators, not only the SDG 12C1 on fossil fuel subsidies, but basically there are a number of different custodian agencies who actually are responsible for collecting data on different SDG indicators. So in principle, the data that we should receive from countries are national data, and then that would actually go through this harmonization and there are other processing for international comparability, and then it would actually feed into the SDG global database that is maintained by the US Statistical Department. Next one, please. So as I mentioned, under SDG C is about rationalizing inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, and under that there is a specific indicator to measure the amount of fossil fuel subsidies per unit of GDP, and both from production and consumption side. And the original language, though, actually also has a proportion of total national expenditure on fossil fuel subsidies, but in our methodology paper, we actually advise not to use this way to actually measure the fossil fuel subsidies, because it's not actually commonly used way to measure fossil fuel subsidies. So it is recommended to drop this part of the indicator. Next one, please. So just briefly, I mean, initially, as some of you may know, this indicator SDG 12C1 was classified as a tier 3, which actually indicates that there is no internationally established methodology or standards to measure that. But with this methodology submitted to the interagency expert group on SDG, and it was accepted and approved by them. So there is a recognition that there is internationally established methodology and standards. So this indicator was basically upgraded to tier 2. And then if the data are regularly produced by at least 50% of countries, then this indicator will be finally upgraded as a tier 1. Next one, please. Next one, please. So let me get into the sort of key messages and recommendations of this methodology paper. The first one is the definition of the term fossil fuel. And we actually have a look at the definition of fossil fuels across, a number of different key reports and materials by different organizations such as IEA, IPCC, OECD, G20 Peer review process. And our recommendation is to include secondary commodities, so meaning electricity and heat and etc., based on the definition provided by the IES statistical manual. And we also recommend to include the non-energy uses of fossil fuels other than electricity, heat, and others. But we actually propose that reporting can be optional, given the challenges in terms of available data and the capacity for countries to be able to actually collect data on this specific category. Next one, please. Now, in terms of the definition of subsidies, our recommendation is to use WTO definition of subsidies in the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measure, because it is the most widely recognized one of a subsidy and the only definition that is legally binding for WTO members. And also, it's a simplified version of that being used by several G20 review countries as well. I would clarify, though, that there might be some people confused about what we are actually recommending here. What we are recommending here is to use the definition of what constitutes subsidies under this WTO agreement. But there, in this the WTO agreement, there are a whole bunch of other provisions that explained about what subsidies are trade distorting and what subsidies are actually subject to these countervailing measures, and that is not included in these recommendations because it's not about trade distorting subsidies. The only definitions that we are recommending and borrowing from the WTO agreement is, the what constitutes subsidies, and that's where it actually stops. Period. Next one, please. Now, in terms of the definitions of production and consumption, our recommendation is to use OECD definition, producer support estimate, consumer support estimate, and general service support estimate. It's because this OECD definition, we find that is statistically clear, clearly distinguish the consumer and producer subsidies, and also the system of national accounts actually distinguishes two categories. But they actually refer only to payments made. This is our recommendation to use OECD definitions for this, and then the monitoring, the data and the production and consumption could be done separately. But when they're actually reporting on this data, they could be also reported together. So we actually give options to countries. Next one, please. Now, in terms of estimating subsidies to fast-serve viewers, our recommendation is to use both a price gap and inventory approaches. It's because even if they're not mutually exclusive, in order to actually have a complete picture of fast-serve subsidies, combination of these two approaches would actually be complementary. And of course, given that it's not mutually exclusive, there is a need to take measures to avoid double counting. So, for example, if you look at the direct transfer of government funds to producers, I mean, this is not going to change the price immediately, but it would actually reduce production costs and therefore actually reduce the prices in the longer term. And by using this both inventory approaches and price gap, we can actually capture this type of subsidies as well. Next one, please. I think, can you go to the one slide before? I think we skipped that one. Yeah. So basically, this is our recommendation. So out of 4 categories of subsidies, so there is a direct transfer of funds. Induced transfer, basically, it actually means a price support. And the third category is a tax expenditure, other revenues foregone, and under pricing of goods and services. And the fourth one is transfer of risk. And across these 4 categories, we actually have assessed based on the 3 criteria in terms of what we would actually recommend. So the first criteria is the data availability, whether the data is readily available. The second criteria is how complex it is to measure these categories of subsidies. And then the third one is whether these are currently acceptable practices. And then our recommendation is to measure and report the first 3 categories, so direct transfer of funds, induced transfers, and the tax expenditures, other revenues foregone. Because, for instance, in the case of direct transfer of funds, I mean, governments are reporting in their budgets on this, and they are actually well documented currently, and it's often publicly available, and then it's found in a country's system of national accounts on subsidies. In the case of induced transfers, the data on energy price is readily available, though the data to calculate the reference price could be improved. So we are also looking at how this, calculation of reference price can be improved. I would actually speak about it later a little bit. The third category, tax expenditures and other resources foregone, we recommend to include this one in monitoring and measuring and reporting. However, we made this category optional for countries to measure and report, given some of the challenges associated with that. So I would actually speak a little bit about the challenges related to measuring this category of subsidy, tax expenditures, and other revenues foregone, as well as a transfer of risks to government, which we actually do not recommend to include the last one, transfer of risks to government. Next one, please. So basically, the tax expenditures and other revenues foregone, I mean, currently there are only 24 out of 118 countries publish core information on tax expenditure. And there's a lack of established accounting and reporting practices. And also the transparency is questionable, so that it actually prevents the international comparability. And in terms of actual measuring this tax expenditure, there is a fair level of complexity related to this, also because benchmarks set on the country-by-country basis. And even if there is a certain level of acceptability on this category because it's included in the review, for instance, but it still remains controversial due to differences in national tax system. And it's also a very data-intensive process of measuring capturing these subsidy categories. So our recommendation is to include this category, but we actually made it optional for countries depending on their data availability and capacity to look into this category of subsidies. And the transfer of risk to governments is simply because it's also a very data-intensive process of measuring this category of subsidies, and it's very difficult to quantify. So our recommendation is not to include this thing in measuring this subsidy category. Next one, please. So in the methodology and during the consultation, it actually appeared very clear that there is a still further knowledge gap to be filled in. That includes developing a guidance note on specific types of subsidies, notably this measuring tax expenditures and also the calculation of the price cap. It also appeared very clearly that there is quite a bit of gap in terms of capacity across countries in collecting data and then measuring these fossil fuel subsidies. So there should be a greater effort to build capacity across countries in measuring this subsidy. So the last slide, please. We think that this data collection process is going to be a phased process, which actually means that for the first few years, the data should be collected starting from 2020 until 2030. But we expect that there will not be a sufficiently available data from countries, the national data. So for the first few years, we may actually resort to globally available data, building the global database, but gradually this will be actually replaced with the national data as we actually go on with the data collection process. The next one, please. So thank you very much for your attention, and then you can actually find the methodology paper can be downloaded from the below web links, and you can find more information about the work that the UNEP is doing on measuring fossil fuels. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joy. And just stay with us a moment, please, if you could, because the questions are coming in. And I've got a question from Halim Lee for you, which is, you mentioned about producer and consumer subsidies. Does this methodology cover the whole fossil fuel supply chain, so extraction, refining, and combustion?
I must say that conceptually, yes, but this methodology by no means is not perfect. And I must also say that this methodology is still evolving. So there is quite a bit of gap to be still filled in. And then we, UNEP, together with the partners, actually need to develop a further very specific technical guidance in the area where we feel, and then where also the others actually indicate that there is quite a bit of knowledge gaps. So I would say that there are some available materials that we actually have also included the references to the other materials that we actually look at it and build on that can provide a first guidance on these issues on measuring the producer subsidies. But as I mentioned, there is still a bit of knowledge gaps that we still need to fill in with further development of methodologies and practical guidance.
Thank you, Joy. I think that's very helpful, and thank you for a very good presentation of the methodology itself, what it covers, some of the challenges from it, and some of the things we can do with it. Our next speaker I'd now like to introduce is Aldo Revati Duvan. Aldo will be known to many of you already from his work with the Italian government and in many international and regional fora as well. He's currently the Chief Economist at the Directorate General for Sustainable Development, EU and International Relations of the Italian Ministry of Environment, SOGECID TA as an acronym. He chairs the OECD Committee on Environmental Performance Country Reviews, having chaired various others, including on taxation and environment and ecosystems over the years. And then recently, he was the technical coordinator at the G7 Environment Italian presidency in 2017, is the Italian representative on a whole range of international fora, and also played a very strong leading role in the recent G20 peer review of the fossil fuel subsidies in Italy, which was paired with Indonesia. And somehow within all this, he also finds time to teach sustainable development at the University of Roma Luis. So I'm not quite sure how you do that, Aldo, but well done to you. So Aldo, you've obviously also, one thing I didn't mention in the introduction then, which I'm sure you'll talk about more, is that Italy has performed self-reviews also of its environmentally harmful and friendly subsidies with a very wide scope and a lot of detail. So you've used various methodologies over the years to generate numbers on subsidies. You've been involved with this SDG 12C1 indicator methodology report as well. So we'd really like to hear from you on the Italian experience at bringing data together and reporting it, and how we might use this methodology going forward. So the floor is yours, and thank you again for joining us today, Aldo.
Thank you, Peter. Greetings to all colleagues around the planet from Rome. Next slide, please. We'll try to share from here. I am with Jonathan Castaldi behind me of a team of environmental economists working here at the Italian Ministry of Environment. What we tried to do in the last 3-4 years to try to advance on this topic. The first thing is the G20 process and the peer review of Italy, then the Italian catalog that you mentioned, Peter, and then some other initiatives which are going on. Next. The G20 process, next slide, please. The G20 process on the Italian peer review has been a key process for us, and I think that all countries can try to make such an exercise. It's not only limited to G20 countries. We know that in these very days, Netherlands is working on this topic, and we were working in parallel with Indonesia, who will speak later, with Anna, and we've been twins in this exercise. It was very interesting. We followed USA and China, we followed Germany and Mexico. It's a very interesting exercise, even if we have a very strong mandate, because everything starts with the G20 in 2009 in Pittsburgh, with an encouragement to tackle with an efficient fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption, reduce our energy security, impede investment in clean energy sources, and undermine efforts to deal with the threat of climate change. And this is extremely important because we are dealing with fossil fuel subsidies because apparently we have a problem with climate change. I think we should always keep this in mind. Now, may I attract our attention on some of the international diplomatic wording which sometimes come out in these commitments. Inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. As economists, our view is that all fossil fuel subsidies are inefficient from an economic and from an ecological environmental point of view. They might be efficient from a social point of view, but we have other better alternatives for subsidizing those who are in need. Industrial sectors, those in need from a social point of view. We suggest from our analysis that it is better to help them with direct subsidies which are transparent and not through an underpricing of fossil fuels. And this is probably one of the major guidelines for our activity at national and international level. In our G20 peer review, we try to rebuild all the commitments which have been taken by the international community, because we are going one step forward, two back, three forward, and so on. So we will see, next slide, that from Seoul 2010, next slide, please, to St. Petersburg, to the Brisbane summit, but we have a slight nuances in the commitments which have been taken. Please refer to our G20 peer review of Italy, and you can find the 20 pages of all international commitments on these topics, G20, G7, European Union recommendations, national, international, OECD, and so on. Next slide, please. In the G20 peer reviews of Italy, as you may know, they have been officially launched in Japan in April this year. For our review, we found 39 measures that might contribute to the production and consumption of fossil fuels. We also introduced in the self-review from Italy a simulation model with different scenarios in order to have some evidence of impact on our economy and on environment due to the removal and the revenue recycling of fossil fuel subsidies. And we hope this kind of assessment can be developed by other countries and at international level. We have prepared a technical analysis, then it will be to our political leaders to assume the responsibilities and decide how quick, in which way to abolish or at least reform fossil fuel subsidies. The exercise, as we know, has been chaired by OECD, and we are very grateful to them. All this can be found in this link, which is reported in the slide. Next slide, please. We listed the 39 measures that we found. It was not an exercise only by the Italian Ministry of Environment, which includes climate change responsibility, but it was in conjunction with the Ministry of Economic Development and Ministry of Economy and Finance. So we had to find a national position. And the agreement, the compromise, or possibly the synthesis forward, was to have 3 parts. A list of fossil fuel subsidies as a priority, a second list with fossil fuel subsidies which are more difficult and need to be analyzed carefully, and the third short list with international fossil fuel subsidies which need international reform, say the international aviation or the international shipping exemptions of kerosene have to be treated inside the reform of the ICAO and IMO agreement, or the European Union ETS free quotas, emission trading schemes, free quotas for CO2 and other climate change gases, they have to be negotiated at European levels. We analyze things trying to follow the 5 sectors which were priority: agriculture, energy, households and public services, industry and transport, and we estimated the total value of fossil fuel subsidies up to 14 billion euros for 2016. We had a very large peer review team. I think it's the largest until now in the G20 processes. We had 9 experts from countries. We had 2 IGOs, we had think tanks and universities. Canada and Argentina have entered the exercise for this year, and they were present, and we were very pleased to work with a lot of good experts. Netherlands, as I mentioned, is going through. Now, what are the main lessons what we got? I think first that countries, thanks to this kind of peer reviews, G20 or non-G20, are encouraged to look at their internal policies and measures in a systematic way, and this is extremely useful. Lessons are to be learned from experts participating to the peer review team. The countries might achieve awareness on the environmental, social and economic impacts of their fiscal policy, sharing this knowledge base across ministry. And we can discover heterogeneity of approaches among different countries on the definition of subsidy. We had different approaches with the 3 major ministries involved: the MEF, the Ministry of Economy and Finance, the Ministry of Economic Development, which in our jargon is the Ministry for Energy, Industry and Trade, and the third one, which is the Ministry of Environment, Land and Sea. Next slide, please. All this started thanks to what we call the Italian catalog, the Italian inventory of environmentally harmful subsidies and environmentally friendly subsidies. We tried to be fair. Next slide, please. We tried to prepare knowledge at national level. Next slide, please. And we studied how to introduce this in a strong, robust way. The Parliament asked us to prepare such a catalogue. This is obviously extremely important, and it asked the Ministry of Environment to prepare it and to be supported by other ministries and other public organization and research center. Next, please. This allowed us to prepare with serenity and seriously to identify, classify and quantify the amount of subsidies in general, not only fossil fuel subsidies, even if fossil fuel subsidies are the most important. And the definition of subsidies, which was adopted by Italian Parliament, was extremely wide, the widest possible, I think. Incentives, tax benefits, preferential financial treatments and exemption, and so on. We have to prepare it every year by July, so it's a yearly report now. The first edition was issued in 2017. We identified 131 measures, positive and negative, and we estimated 16 billion of environmentally harmful subsidies, almost 16 million of environmentally friendly subsidies, mainly in energy efficiency and renewables. Among environmentally harmful subsidies, obviously fossil fuel subsidies are the most important. We estimated about 12 billion euros. The second edition was issued only recently, and in this case we raised up to 19 billions of environmentally harmful subsidies. Friendly subsidies were almost stable, and fossil fuel subsidies are now estimated at 16 billion. Next slide, please. We tried to compare the different definitions, as was already very well analyzed by Kim and by Wooders, and we tended to follow the OECD definition. Next slide, please, even if we're open to use the WTO or what we will find from the international work. So a subsidy is a measure that keeps prices for consumers below market levels, or prices for producers above market levels, or that reduces costs for producers and consumers through direct or indirect support. Next slide, please. And we analyzed both friendly and harmful subsidies, and then we went down to distinguish between direct and indirect subsidies, trying to understand what are the different forms. I will leave this with the the slides, which will remain common knowledge, and trying to understand who is paying the subsidies, because it might be the public budget, or sometimes there might be other financiers. Next slide, please. We had to understand how we go outside the perimeter and have flexibility, because as this was mentioned, we have still some methodological problems which have to be solved, even if we all agree that fossil fuel subsidies are a problem. Can we go forward? Next slide, please. We are giving here an example of the 131 subsidies that we have, just to show how we prepared the report. We prepared a scheme with the name of the measure, and sometimes the name doesn't correspond exactly to the substance. Please beware about that. What is the official aim and what is the real aim? What is the legal source, in which law we can find the subsidy? What kind of subsidy is it methodologically? Then the rates when they are available, and if there is a co-financing by the European Union. For Italy, it might be important. The area of introduction and of cessation, if a sunset clause is expected, a level of reformability. And in the second report, we added also an analysis of the different economic, social, and environmental aspects, because obviously environment is our priority, but we are in a frame of sustainable development. Next slide, please. Finally, we would like to mention some exercise with which we are to which we are participating. Next slide, please. We said the G20 process. Next slide, please. And the Italian catalogue were key. But we are also trying to participate in the European Union efforts. We proposed a project which is called for Europeans, it might be everyday work, supporting the so-called structural reforms. The project is called Environmental Fiscal Reform in Italy and the European Union. Obviously, making an environmental fiscal reform requires to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, possibly progressively in a wise way, but we can do it, and it's a key part. And obviously, if we can work with our neighbors, our partners, possibly even at a global level, it's going to be much, much easier. So we are starting this project in these very days. We will try to deal with the different aspects of shifting the fiscal burden from income, labor, companies towards natural resources and pollution. Next. We have been part of this exercise that Joy Kim has described of indicator 12C. It's very important that we go ahead. May I remind that the indicator is on fossil fuel subsidies. It's not on inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, and it's not on encouraging only wasteful consumption, because we encourage through fossil fuel subsidies also production. And this is a problem. Next slide. And we are participating to something which is called the Task Force on Measuring Fossil Fuel Subsidies. This is the London group. It is led by Statistics Sweden. It's a network of statisticians which are working in the frame of UNEP. And I think that wherever we are at Ministries of Environment or at Ministries of Finance, we have to build strong alliances with the experts from the statistical world. With this, I think we have come to an end. Thank you very much for your patience. It's very interesting, and we look forward to work in the future on fossil fuel subsidies all together, because we have an important responsibility on this side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aldo. Excellent presentation covering a huge amount of material, and also I think a very good illustration there of the work that's gone into producing the catalogue and the inventories in Italy. You mentioned 131 measures were assessed, and good to see one of your very strong team, Jonata, behind you, and I know you've had a lot of support across the Italian government. A few questions have come in, I think, which I'd like to ask if you could deal with now, if that were possible. You mentioned that the indicator itself doesn't talk about inefficiency and wasteful. A couple of questions came in though about, are there efficient fossil fuel subsidies? What does wasteful mean? And in terms of modelling, what evidence did you produce, and what evidence could be available for people to show the impacts of subsidy reform on the economy, on labour markets, on other economic indicators? And I know your group has looked at some of these issues.
Thank you, Peter, and to colleagues who asked the questions. What I tried to say is that in our analysis, there are no efficient fossil fuel subsidies, not from an economic point of view, not from an environmental point of view. In some cases, I think that this wording came out from a necessity of Argentinian colleagues at G20, who raised the issue that they were helping the poor in Buenos Aires for heating. And they said, those are efficient for us, we need them. And other countries hid behind Argentina with this wording. But our point, which I would like to submit to colleagues, is that we can help those in need, the poor, an industrial sector in crisis, with direct, transparent subsidies, and not through an underpricing of coal, of oil, of natural gas. It doesn't make sense to make damage to the environment because we want to help the poor. Those in need, it is a political choice, it is a moral choice. We want to help them, and we have to take measures for that, but not through environmentally damaging measures. This is our point. Wasteful consumption, fossil fuel subsidies are encouraging wasteful consumption and wasteful production. So we have to get rid of them, not next night, maybe progressively through a process of 2, 4, 10 years. We'll see in each country what we need, but it is not through this way that we can go on. On the impact, environmental and economic impact, the modeling, the macroeconomic modeling is helpful. I suggest for those who are interested in these aspects to go to the G20 Peer review of Italy, to the part which is called the self-report by Italy, by the country itself. And we tried this model, and we can do much more, but I think it's a good start.
Good. And did you have any comment on sort of tools you'd use to do economic analysis of effects on competitiveness or the economy or labour markets or anything like that of subsidy reform?
I think this is, in our analysis, it's a general equilibrium model, and so you can go through these aspects. Competitiveness might be a problem, but there are compensation measures. Social aspects are a problem, but there are alternative measures. Leakage is a possible problem, but there are measures. We've been studying this all together. For example, OECD countries, we have alternative measures that we can use. Our point is to take the political decision to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, to do it in a wise way, progressively, giving the time for transition, energy transition, ecological transition, whatever we want to call it. But all the other problems come after. This is what we found.
Thank you, Aldo. I had a comment here you might like as well from Laurie van der Berg, Friends of the Earth Netherlands. I wanted to say this is amazing work the Italian Ministry of Environment has done. Congratulations, very useful presentation. And I wanted to follow that up with a question from Kai Schlegelmilch, who asks, Italy's subsidies are 13.9 billion euros from your figures there. Germany's are 55 billion euros from the two reviews. Do you know why there's such a difference? Is this a scope question? Is it because there are different measures in place in the countries?
As probably Kai Schlegelmilch knows well, the Germans have made 3 different assessments of environmentally harmful subsidies. If I remember correctly figures, there are 55 in the analysis of the Environmental Agency of Germany. There are about 25 in the analysis of the Ministry of Environment of Germany, and there are 5 in the Ministry of Finance of Germany assessment inside the G20 peer review of fossil fuel subsidies. There are methodological differences, interpretations on what we consider a subsidy. For example, in Italy, we consider that the difference in taxation between traditional gasoline and diesel in favor of diesel is a subsidy because it's a different tax treatment. From the Ministry of Finance of Italy, they tell us, but there are 2 different rates. So it is interpretable and it is legitimately interpretable. We have this kind of problems, and I must say that in the G20 exercise is very useful, but it depends very much on who is leading. In the case of Indonesia, we had an excellent exercise led by the Ministry of Finance, who knows much more environmental and climate policies than sometimes we do from the Ministry of Environment.
Thank you. So perhaps to summarize that comment, the direct comparability between countries may not be that easy, but undergoing these exercises leads any country into a very worthwhile consideration of its public policy and its public policy objectives. Thank you also again, Aldo, and for your staff, and for leading us in very nicely to our third speaker, who is Ana Zulvia. Ana Zulvia joins us today from the Ministry of Finance from the Republic of Indonesia. She's been with the ministry since 1998, and so has built up a huge amount of experience in issues around public expenditure and around taxation. She, after 10 years with the Ministry of Finance, she then went to the University of Western Australia to major in economics. In 2009, she was promoted to be the Deputy Director for Tax Revenue Policy and kept that position until 2016, when she moved then to be appointed as the Deputy Director for Subsidy Policy itself in Indonesia. She's been a member of a whole range of working groups, including on fossil fuel subsidy reform, including she was a participant in the G20 Mexico Germany peer reviews, in the APEC subsidy review process in Vietnam in 2017, and then of course as the lead on the Indonesian side of the Indonesia-Italy peer review on inefficient fossil fuel subsidy reform, which was done in 2017 and 2018. So we'll hear from Ana about that process with the Italy-Indonesia pairing, but also very usefully, I think the end point of this, and some of the questions have been coming up, is of course about phasing out subsidies, and the generation of information is a step along that process. So Anna's going to focus today on Indonesia's efforts to phase out and rationalize its fossil fuel subsidies. Anna, you are very, very welcome. Thank you for joining us again so late in your day as well, and we really look forward to your intervention now.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Hello, everyone. As has been mentioned by Peter, that today I will be talking about the Indonesian experience in phasing out the fossil fuel subsidy. I will begin to discuss about the rationale behind why Indonesia should do the kind of reform for the fossil fuel subsidies, and then I will go on with the highlight the reform that has been done, as well as I will talk about the impact of the reform itself. And then finally, I will briefly discuss with you about the next agenda that Indonesia will be going through for the next year or next couple of years. So maybe we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so in this slide, I will explain about the reason behind why Indonesia need to passing out the fossil fuel subsidy. The first issue is the fact that Indonesia has transformed from the net oil exporter toward net oil importer. So as may you aware that since early 1980s, 1990s, Indonesia had abundant source of the oil, but after that the production starting to decline, and to fulfill the energy demand, we have to do kind of import. In 2003, we became a net oil importer, and as you can see from the up graph here, in 2012, Indonesia recorded a deficit in the oil and gas trade balance. So it means that it will give some effect as well to our national account balance. So this is not a good performance for us. We still really depend on the fossil fuel. So the next issue is about the limited fiscal space. As the energy subsidy has taken a big portion of our budget, it will give some limited to the budget to be spent in the productive way. So here the government provides some subsidy budget, mostly in the gasoline, diesel, and then LPG, as well as to kerosene and to the electricity subsidies. And this is a huge amount, about 20 up to 20. So the percentage of the total of energy subsidy to the budget. So we can see here that the amount that has been spent for the energy subsidy is more than can be spent for another productive spending. Can we go to the next slide, please? And next slide, please. Okay, so this is the second issue that we were facing at that time. We found that the energy subsidy at that time was poorly targeted, as the fuel subsidy is delivered as the tax gap, as the price gap. So everyone can get access to get the more cheaper price in the fossil fuel. So by means here, the richer people, the more benefit that they can get. So here in the top highest, the top 20 highest, the rich people, they benefit the most compared to the lowest 20% of the poor people. So based on this finding, we can say that energy subsidy was very poorly targeted. And then the last one is about the behavior, that as the price is very cheap, so it promotes to wasteful consumption. And then here you can see from the year 2006 up to 2013, the number of the consumption is keep increasing. So if for us it's not really good if we still keep the giving the fossil fuel subsidy. So the next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so in this slide, we can see the story about the subsidy policy in Indonesia, especially for the energy subsidy. So since 1977, government started to provide subsidy on the 7 types of fossil fuel subsidy, and the number is kept increasing. And actually, this is give us very limited fiscal space, as I have mentioned before. But actually started in 2014, government already started to do some reform, especially in the electricity subsidy. And at that time, government tried to increase the tariff and also excluded some group that cannot get the subsidy electricity. For the reform that has been done in 2015 and going forward, we can go to the next slide. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so when we talk about the energy reform, so 2015 is the biggest reform that Indonesia has been done here. So in 2015, the government of Indonesia removing subsidy on the gasoline and also implementing fixed subsidy on diesel. And at this time, actually, the increase in price already started a year before in 2014, but still after that, we still have a small number of subsidy, and the subsidy clearly eliminated in 2015 here. So in 2015, we only have subsidy for the kerosene, which is mainly utilized by the poor people. And we also still have subsidy on the diesel, but the amount of subsidy is fixed in a sort of number. So for the diesel, we didn't give a full price cap anymore. In this term, we make kind of the progress, which is reduce the subsidy on the diesel. So this is kind of a huge achievement for Indonesia when we can remove the biggest subsidy on the gasoline. And then the next slide, please. Next slide, please. And then this is another reform that has been done in terms of policy in the electricity subsidy. As I has mentioned before, actually since 2013, 2014, the government has tried to reduce the number of the group that receive some benefit from the subsidy. And in 2017, it is the most valuable reform that has been done in the electricity sector, because at that time, for the household customer who can get the subsidy only for the poor and the vulnerable. So by this limitation on the beneficiaries, we only limit the beneficiaries only for the poor people. And to guarantee that all this approach still give some benefit for the poor people, government also provides some complaint management to ensure all the people getting benefit from electricity subsidy. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is maybe the one that connect with the explanation the Kim before, and here we counted the amount of the fiscal impact in terms of the budget space. So as you know, we have spent a lot of money in subsidy, especially for the energy subsidy. Here, after we did some reform, we got a lot of saving. So in terms of 3 years, for example, start 2015 until 2017, there was kind of a saving for the budget is around 67 billion US dollars. So this is a huge amount to be spent to the more productive way. So here you can see that the number of subsidies declined, but on the other hand, the number of the infrastructure spending is increasing, as well as the government the government still remain to stay in the maintaining the mandatory spending for the education about 20%. So based on the methodology that has been used from Indonesian side, we calculate the saving from the energy subsidy removal as our calculation for the more income revenue to funding another productivity sector. And then impact on the fuel consumption on the right graphic here, you all can see that start 2014, the number of the volume consumed by people are decreasing. So it means that the price is matter. So the more expensive price, the less people will consume for the fossil fuel. And then go to the next slide, please. And the next slide will show to can you go back to the last one? Okay, this one, thank you. So These figures show us that the increasing price on the fuel or even the electricity tariff adjustment at that time, yes, it gave us a shock in the inflation, but at the time we still can maintain the expected inflation steady low. So the shock only for short time, but after that the inflation getting back into the normal level. So we can say that this is not a huge increasing in the inflation when we do the increase, when we do kind of increasing for the oil price. And then the next slide, please. Can we? Yes. So in this slide, maybe I can share how did the Indonesian government at that time doing this kind of the reform. So before the government decided to do kind of the reform, we have kind of discussion with and doing some analytical evidence and working close together with all the partnerships such as the ADB, IMF, and the World Bank, and they together with them we can have kind of study and show kind of the what the negative impact as we give a lot of subsidy on the energy. And then at the time as well, we try to build kind of communication, not only to the stakeholders, but also to the public, especially to the student. And then at the same time as well, the government provide kind of the social protection plan to help for the poor people. So in this case, the poor people who will get the more impact, they can have another solution by receiving some of the social protection. And then at the time as well, why is it possible to do the reform? Because in 2015 the oil price is relatively low, so it is kind of a good blessing for us, because when we're doing the economically price, so at that time the price is not very high, so we can minimize the risk on the inflation itself. So next slide. I think that will be the last slide from me. So this is the next agenda that we are planning to go. So here, as our fossil utilization of our fossil fuel is decreasing, of course we have to go to the more clean energy. That's why the government try to promote the development of the renewable energy, because Indonesia actually has abundant resource for the renewable energy, but no, the potential is not utilized as maximal as we can. So this is our homework. How can we promoting the renewable energy to replace the fossil fuel energy? And then the second agenda is gradually moving the energy pricing policy to the market mechanism. Of course, this is not an easy way for us, because when we talk about the pricing policy, it will connect directly to the people, to the inflation. So in this case, the government should be very careful to do this the policy. We have to make kind of balances between how to make the energy pricing is as good as should be, but on the other hand, we still keep the low income people in that level with having kind of the good opportunity. So the last one is about the designing a better targeted energy subsidy policy itself. So for example, for the LPG 3 kilogram, we need to move forward to the more close distribution, because nowadays the subsidy for the LPG is still open. That's why everyone can buy the cheaper LPG, and this is our biggest homework. And hopefully by next year we can do the close distribution LPG. And then of course the last one is about the expanding the implementation of targeted electricity subsidy, which is before only into household with household with 900 power. Now we're trying to move the household with 450 power. So they should be registered or should be eligible under the poverty line. So I think these three agenda are not very easy to do, but at least the Indonesian government commit to do commit to maintain the energy reform that has been started for a couple years ago. And I think this is the end of my presentation. Peter.
Yeah, excellent, Anna. Thank you so much. And there are a whole set of questions that had come in basically from the start of the webinar, when I think your presentation answered so many of these very, very well. There were a couple, though, that perhaps would be good to focus in on. I mean, firstly, it was really, really interesting to hear how this has been part of a phased approach, starting with gasoline and diesel and moving on to electricity and taking concern of inflation and so on. You mentioned in your presentation as well, though, reaching out to the public through a public campaign to inform them what was going on and why you were doing this. And we wondered if they had a little bit more detail on the sort of things you did and why.
Okay, so about the public campaign, as you know, usually when there is increasing in oil price, there can some what you call it protest from the people, especially from the student, and then sometimes it gives some bad what you call it, bad impact or maybe bad effect to the government, whether the government will go with the policy or stay in the same price. So at that time, we do some communication with them, and not only from the government, but we also include our peers to share the idea why the government should do this kind of the reform on the energy subsidy. Is that answer your question, Peter?
Yes, thank you very much. Another question from this one from Hannes Grev was about do industrial customers still receive fossil fuel subsidies in Indonesia? And if those have been phased out, what was the timing of that? Was the timing of subsidy reform driven by competitiveness concerns?
Okay, about the industrial, if we talk about the subsidy energy in terms of the diesel, they are not eligible to get that kind of the subsidy for the industrial. But at least for the small scale industry, we still provide kind of the subsidy. However, for another one, for example, in terms of the electricity subsidy, the subsidy still provided to the group that is under small scale industry as well, kind of the micro industry. But for the biggest industry, we haven't considered them into the eligible one. Maybe I can tell you more about the definition of the subsidy that has been included in our self-report, because different with kind of method that has been explained by Kim. In our perspective here, in Indonesia perspective, the subsidy here only calculated the price gap subsidy. So we haven't got any chance to calculate in terms of the tax expenditure. So maybe the competitiveness will be very related with that, because so far we still have a lot of incentive on the tax. So this is still, frankly speaking, we didn't put it in our self-report. So this is very hard to get the data. So still we get some challenge on collecting the tax expenditure regarding giving subsidy on the industry in terms of that competitiveness.
Thank you very much, Anna. And please stay on the line. And if I could ask as well, Aldo and Joy to also switch yourselves back on and unmute yourself. We've got some time now, another 15 minutes for a more general Q&A session. Thank you all for answering the questions specific to your presentations. And these are the sort of general questions that I think we've been looking at as we've gone through, but a couple of specific ones. Firstly, from Nora Berg, who's asking, are there support services available to help governments navigate this process? Other questions came in about, are there materials available, and is there perhaps some capacity building available? So if you could, if any of you wanted to take the question on, what would you advise other countries going through this process to do, and what sort of levels of support services and materials, what are the things they should be looking at when they're completing the process? Aldo, did you want to start? You're on mute at the moment. I'm sorry, I'm not hearing Aldo. I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you. I'm not sure why. Joy. Yeah, that's perfect, Aldo. Thank you.
First, you need a group of experts which can work on these things. So technically prepared on environment, on economics, on sustainable development. Second, you need a lot of patience to deal with other legitimate interests inside the government. Third, it might be useful also to look around the NGOs. In the Italian case, we have an interesting report by Legambiente, which is one of the major environmental NGOs on fossil fuel subsidies, and together with one of the political parties, Radicali Italiani, on estimating the fossil fuel subsidies. Now, obviously, there again, you might have different methodological approaches, but if it is done in good faith, we will find the possibilities of understanding the differences. The report by the Italian civil society has been extremely useful and positive, even if we have some detailed dissension on some of the items.
Thank you. Joy, did you have also some comments to make about supporting countries and the resources available?
Yes, I mean, what Aldo has mentioned, what can be done at the domestic national level is very useful. From our side as UNEP and then international organizations and those who actually are like-minded in this area, I mean, what we actually have noticed by undertaking selective countries pilot studies just to understand about where the countries stand, what kind of definitions they use, what kind of data has been collected, etc. I mean, it shows really a diverse range of capacity and the data availability across countries. So I think that definitely there is a very clear need in providing a support and building capacity. I mean, this type of webinar and then other outreach activities that we are participating to disseminate further about the key issues of the methodology is one such way, and then the first step, if you like. And we plan to, as I mentioned, that I think we also have a plan to develop a bit further of the technical note that can fill in the further knowledge gaps that still are out there. And then we plan to also do outreach, particularly focusing on developing countries, but at the regional level, to address the countries in the regions in terms of communicating with them and then disseminating the information and the technical support in this area, so that they actually are better equipped to start collecting data and then monitor this information.
Thank you. And Anna, did you also want to respond on this one?
Yeah, I think data is the important thing here to be considered, because I don't know, maybe for many countries they already have more sophisticated data, but another country maybe have like less in available data. So in case we want to calculate anything about the impact of the subsidy reform, it really depends on the data, and also the technical support. Also, I agree with that. And yes, that's all I can add. Okay.
Thank you. And there was a further question in French. I've translated to English. I hope I'm right. This is from Leon Chizungu, who's in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, asking, is it necessary to prioritize developing countries first in this process? And is there technical and other assistance available from the development banks, so the World Bank and others, to support here? Does anybody want to try that one?
I mean, I would mention that I don't necessarily think that there is any prioritization given to developing countries. I mean, at least under in the context of the SDG process. I mean, this actually applies to all UN member countries. So, both the developed and developing countries. But just to, as I actually mentioned, that when we actually did a few pilot studies, in the developing world, I mean, it shows the diverse level of capacity across countries. So we recognize that there is a need to provide the support and build further capacity in developing countries. I am not aware at the moment whether there is continuous technical assistance being delivered by other development agencies or the other international organizations. I know that there has been continuous work in this area. I don't know whether that's necessarily in the nature of technical assistance per se, but we can find out a bit more about what others are doing so that we can also join forces with other partners as well. And then I would just mention one last thing, that for us, actually, the capacity building is to focus on SDG focal points in countries, and they are largely statistical.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm also personally aware, I know the World Bank's ESMAP program, Leon, has been working on subsidies, as Joy mentioned, for several years, and they do provide technical assistance to countries on subsidy reform issues. And if you need some contacts to get in touch with them, it's no guarantee that they would have money available for DRC this year or next year or whatever, but I think it would be worth making a request to them. On the screen in front of us, we've got this question, the first one in dark blue, about how can countries account for indirect and in-kind subsidies, tax and energy rebates, absence of financial guarantees, accelerated depreciation. So Anna, in your presentation, you noted that moving into the tax expenditure space was more difficult and you needed more data and analysis. And I think the indicator reflects that by saying that countries should report on their tax expenditures and their revenue foregone subsidies as they go along. But to you, the panelists, this is probably the most difficult area of this indicator, the revenue foregone, the tax expenditures. Do you have any advice to countries who are looking at this maybe for the first time or maybe in the early stages?
Okay, so based on our experience, actually Indonesia has started to calculate our tax expenditure, but not specifically by sector. So of course, if you want to go to consider tax expenditure, this is can be considered as the new step to beginning calculate the tax expenditure as the whole. And I think for the country who has like the new one to go with the kind of this kind of reform, I think they need to consider the national interest as the first place. So despite of, yes, of course we need to do some reform, but still the national interest will be firstly taken into account.
Thank you. And Aldo, did you want to come in on this one?
When I start to speak, I'm cancelled out, but I'm back. Thank you. When we talk about tax expenditure, for us, this was the easiest because we had a fantastic cooperation with the Ministry of Finance and we had the chance that data were available. So it was the easiest part of our job, I must say. May I come back a second on the difference between developed and developing countries?
Please.
Here a major difference. In each of our countries, we have strong debates about these issues. We will find lobbies, even legitimate lobbies, who try to defend what are the privileges which have been established through the years and decades with fossil fuel subsidies. And we have to work to convince that this doesn't make sense and that there are alternatives. There is the possibility of technical assistance and cooperation. I'm thinking to the small groups of economists working in IMF, World Bank, UNEP. Joy is in the team of economists, and certainly they would be helpful if there are possibilities. OECD, but also some think tanks. I will not mention Green Budget Europe because I have a bias. I happen to be the president of Green Budget Europe this period, but I'm thinking to EEB, the European Environment Bureau, or IEEP. Obviously, Peter is working with GSI, IISD. They have capacity. The World Resources Institute. If you look around think tanks, you have good experts who are capable to work and cooperate on these issues. And country government experts also would be pleased to help countries who wish to advance.
Thank you. Joy, did you have any further advice on this sort of third category of the indicator?
I mean, the only thing that I would actually mention, though, is everybody recognizes that there is a long way to go when it comes to tax expenditures. But, you know, we know that there are some countries like Italy and others who actually have a look at it. I also know that there are folks out there who are exclusively only looking at the tax expenditures, not necessarily only in the context of fossil fuel subsidies, but in general tax expenditures to try to improve the transparency on tax expenditures and etc. And I think that perhaps to create opportunity in the forum where the experiences of those countries actually have gone through this process can be shared with other countries, you know, might actually be helpful, and then first a few steps perhaps.
No, I think that's a good general point as well, the sort of sharing of information. I think we've heard a lot today as well about from specific countries and from specific processes and some of the materials they've looked at and used, and sort of building up this database and this wealth of knowledge and making sure that everybody's got access to it is going to be one of the key things going forward. And we just got 2 minutes left, and there's sort of one group of questions, if you like, one group of questions that I'd like to bring together, which would be, it's clear that there are many ministries and agencies involved in this, in subsidy data and the subsidy reform process and the issues around it in the countries. Do you have any advice for countries now, you know, looking to report on SDG indicator 12C1 about how they should work in that multi-agency environment? Is it necessary to have a champion ministry? Is it necessary to have the involvement of the Prime Minister's office? You know, what's the way to do this? Perhaps I could start with you, Anna. I know you've pulled it together from a Ministry of Finance perspective, but many other agencies and ministries involved in Indonesia.
Okay, thank you. Actually, for the process itself in Indonesia, yes, Ministry of Finance as the champion, but actually we also are working together with other ministries, kind of the energy and as well as the environment. But how can I say? But the fact that some data cannot be calculated when we talk about the environment, so it's something that we need to improve in terms of Indonesia. So I saw a question from Sirini here from the chat, and is asking about the impact on the reduced pollution. So we didn't have that calculation yet at that time, but I believe now we're starting to think about that. So maybe this is also lesson learned from us, because usually we only look at a subsidy in terms of only of the subsidy in terms of finance. So actually, when we talk about the subsidy, it will really correlate it with another ministry. So as Aldo said before, that actually this process gave us lesson learned that we need to work together when we talk about the subsidy policy. So it doesn't matter whether the Ministry of Finance, whether the environment, or whether the energy ministry, they should be working together. I mean, this is not only one policy, but one policy for one ministry, but this is all policy for the government. So it's really good to get this lesson learned that we have to work together in terms of talking about the subsidy policy.
Thank you. And Aldo, you mentioned the need to have some patience and there being legitimate interests on the government. Any sort of further advice on bringing this together across government?
You need patience. We've been suffering for a long while recently, and finally yesterday in the new government, a new economic program, we discovered a number of mentioning of the need for environmental fiscal reform, for removing environmentally harmful subsidies, first of all, fossil fuel subsidies. Now we'll see how implementation will go, but obviously sometimes the winds are favorable. Maybe adding on what Anna Zulbia said, yes, we need a group of experts anywhere preparing serious, robust analysis, and then we need important alliances among ministries of finance, economy, energy and industry, environment, including climate. And then also probably some alliances with the statisticians and with processes going on. So for example, in the frame of a climate change convention, it might be very useful to introduce elements about fossil fuel subsidies in the NDCs, in the national determined contributions. Or, and this is my personal view, it might be extremely important to insert this in the process of environmental fiscal reform. We have to offer something in exchange. When we abate fossil fuel subsidies, we must have something useful to offer in exchange. For example, abating labor taxes. Apparently, we have to pay taxes. I think it's better to pay it on fossil fuels than on our labor, on our salaries every month. Thank you.
Thank you, Aldo. A good note. I think we've run just 2 minutes over schedule, so sorry for that. Please excuse my moderation. Very difficult to sum up everything we've heard today, but I think in very simple terms, subsidies impede sustainable development. There are better alternatives available than subsidies to meet the legitimate aims and goals that countries have in public policy. We know, I think it's been demonstrated that transparency helps inform debates, and that those debates will then support a reform process of subsidy reform going forward. It's clear this is going to be an evolving process. I think as countries start reporting next year, maybe their reports will be at a certain level and with a certain scope, and then will improve over time. And it's very, very clear that we all need to support each other, and there are resources available, and that we need to build those communities and those alliances around those. So thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much, Joy. Thank you very much, Aldo and Jonata. I think it's been an excellent webinar. It is recorded in video, so that will be available on the GGKP website. And I'm sure the audience would join me in giving you a big round of applause if they weren't all on mute. So I'll just give a little round of applause on my own. And thank you all very much, presenters, and thank you, audience, for participating so actively. And we look forward to the next webinar. Thank you for now.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.